Let's talk about how to memorize the angles on the unit circle. So if we just look at these outside angles and the axes, notice if I took away my actual unit circle underline here, and you can see it looks like I have 6 equal pieces here. So this would be 0. This would be 1/6 pi 6. This would be 2 pi over 6, but we know that 2/6 is the same thing as 1/3. This would be 3 pi over 6, which is 1/2. This would be 4/6, which is the same thing as 2/3. 5/6, and this would be 6/6, which is just 1 pi. So I know those numbers are hard to see, but this is 0, pi 6, pi thirds, pi halves, 2 pi thirds, 5 pi 6, and pi. I'm just adding 1 to my numerator as I go around and simplifying it. So 1/6, 2/6, 3/6, 4/6, 5/6, 6/6. Okay, that's just for the top quadrant. So let's continue on around. If we just look at these outside angles like we did before, we're continuing to add 6s as we go around. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 6s. This would be 7 6s. This would be 8 6s, which is 4/3. This would be 9 6s, which is 3/2. This would be 10 6s, which is 5/3. 11, and this would be 12 6s, which is just 2 pi. So to get the first and third angles in each quadrant, include the axes, and as we go around counterclockwise, we're adding 1/6. 1/6, 2/6 or a third, 3/6 or a half, 4/6 or 2/3, 5/6, 6/6 or 1, 7/6, 8/6 or 4/3, 9/6 or 3/2, 10/6, 5/3, 11/6, and 12/6, which is 2. And make sure you write a pi with all of those. What about degrees? We could convert each one of those to get our degree measurement, or the degrees is a little bit easier as long as you can add 30 to everything. So instead of us counting and adding up sixths every time, we're just going to add 30. So this will be 30. 30 plus 30 is 60. 60 plus 30 is 90. 90 plus 30 is 120. 150. 180. 210. 240. 270. 300. 330. And 360. So for degrees, you add 30 as you go around if you're looking at the first and third angles and the axes. Okay, well, what about this middle angle? We haven't dealt with it yet, and it's kind of important too. Just like before, if we split it up with the middle angle and the axes, notice that it cuts my semicircle into nice, pretty fourths. These should all be even slices. I just can't draw perfectly well. So this was 1/4 or pi fourths. This would be 2/4, which is 1/2. 3/4, and this would be 4/4 or just pi. Oh, and starting with 0 again, just like before. Continuing on, so this was 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. This would be 5/4. 6/4 is the same thing as 3 pi over 2. 7/4, and this is 8/4, which is the same thing as 2 pi. So when we're thinking in terms of radians and the middle angle with the axes, we add fourths. What about in degrees? In degrees, we add 45. So 45 plus 45 is 90. Plus 45 is 135. plus 45 is 180, plus 45 is 225, plus 45 is 270, plus 45 is 315, plus 45 is 360. So for degrees, as you go around the middle angle and the axes, you add 45. All right, this is going to be really messy, but if you put together your first and third angles and your axes, and your middle angles and your axes, you have the entire unit circle. And notice the green angles that I came up at the axes are the exact same numbers as the blue angles that I came up at the axes, which makes sense because the axes should always be the same angle no matter what. Now that we have all of our angles filled out, how do we remember our coordinate points? There's something called the hand trick. I'm just going to use this to help me memorize the first quadrant, and then I can use mirror images to come up with everything else. All right, first, when we write our coordinate points, everything's going to be written over 2. And this will work for the axes as well. Okay, line your hands up. Your thumb and your pinky are the axes. I could make them nice pretty squares if I needed to, but I didn't draw my picture well enough. Anyhow, okay, so if I put my thumb down, I have 4 fingers up on the left and 0 fingers up on the right. So 4 and 0. All right, I need to square root both of these. So the square root of 4 is 2, and 2 over 2 is just 1. The square root of 0 is 0, and 0 over 2 is 0. So this is my coordinate point. All right, for this 30 degrees, put your finger down. I have 3 fingers up on the left and 1 on the right. So 3 and 1. Square root on both. Well, the square root of 3 doesn't really simplify, so I'm going to just leave that as square root 3. But the square root of 1 is 1. All right, put your middle finger down for the middle coordinate. We have 2 fingers up on the left and 2 fingers up on the right. So 2 on the left, 2 on the right. Square root on both, and neither one simplifies, so this is my coordinate point. All right, put your 4th finger down for the 4th coordinate point. 1 finger is left on the left, and 3 fingers are left on the right. 1 on the left, 3 on the right. Square root them both, and simplify if you can. The square root of 1 is just 1, but the square root of 3 doesn't simplify any further. And then for your last coordinate point, put your pinky down. There are no fingers left on the left, but I have 4 fingers on the right. Square root them both. The square root of 0 is 0, and 0 over 2 is just 0. The square root of 4 is 2, and 2 over 2 is 1. So that is how I use the hand trick to come up with my coordinate points. Put different fingers down and then count how many fingers you have left on the left versus the right. You want to square root those numbers and you put everything over 2. Okay, we've got our first quadrant. How does that help us with everything else? Well, just take these numbers and mirror image them. Flip them over the y-axis. So notice this is square root 3 over 2 and 1/2. When I flip it over the y-axis, that becomes this angle down here. The same thing will happen with my middle angle. When it flips over, my middle angle is still the middle angle and my top angle is still the top angle. The only difference here is now we're in the second quadrant, and in the second quadrant, this is the negative x direction and positive y. So make sure you pay attention to your signs. And the same thing with my axis. If I flip this over my y-axis, it'll be -1, 0. All right, I can do the same exact thing with all of these. If I flip them down over my x-axis, notice my ring finger is the top angle and my pointer finger is the bottom angle. When I flip it over the x-axis, my pointer finger is still closest to the x-axis and my ring finger is still farthest away. That means that I want my pointer fingers to still line up, my middle fingers to still line up, and my ring finger to still line up. And you can either think about flipping over the x-axis this way. When I flipped it, remember my pointer finger was this first one, and when I flip it down, my pointer finger is this angle. My middle finger is this angle. That's a 2. And my ring finger was this angle. For all of these, make sure you pay attention to the signs, plus or minus signs. In the third quadrant, my x coordinate points are negative and my y coordinate points are negative. And in the fourth quadrant, x is positive but y is negative. And the last thing I haven't answered yet is this coordinate point here. Don't forget your axes. They're really easy to forget because they're the easy ones to remember that we don't focus on them, but don't forget them. So that's your whole unit circle. It's all one big pattern for you to have memorized. And it's not terrible. You just have to take a minute to recognize the pattern and figure out what's going on so that you can use the pattern to set up your own unit circle.